In the past 4 years, no game has been as infamous as Poppy Playtime. Considered by many to be an amazing boundary-breaking horror title that rivals the top games in the entire genre, while also considered one of the worst by others. The title has had a fascinating rise to the top of the mascot horror scene, filled with surprises, disappointments, lots of controversies, and everything in between. So today, I'm gonna go over the entire story of Poppy Playtime's rise, from chapter 1 all the way up to today. Our story begins with two animation channels on YouTube, Zamination and Enchanted Mob, who had partnered with each other to help produce content for their respective channels in the past. However, at some point, they wanted to try their hand at creating a video game. More specifically, a horror game in the same genre of videos they were making content for, mascot horror. So in the background, they partnered together to create Bad Games, their game creation company, which would quickly be changed to Mob Games for obvious reasons, and began drawing up an idea for their very own title. This was not Poppy Playtime, but rather something entirely different that up until this point has never been revealed. While developing this mystery game, another YouTube creator, Isaac Christopherson, who worked on his own channel, currently under the name 3A Display, that was also partnered with Enchanted Mob, started helping out with the production of this untitled game. After a while though, Mob for whatever reason would scrap this project altogether and would begin to work on another game centered around toys that would eventually be known as Poppy Playtime, formerly known as other code names like The Toy Game, Toy Story But Evil, and Tina Toy Time, but still was the same thing. The game was going to take a Toy Story inspired approach where you play as a child with parents who worked at what is called the Playtime Co. factory, but after they left for work, the various Playtime Co. toys around the house would come to life and chase the child down. This idea, while pretty interesting on paper, was eventually scrapped as the massive house ended up being extremely boring to traverse, and they instead ended on the much better idea of having the player be a former employee and come to the factory itself after it had been abandoned. At this point, Isaac, who had been trying to get his foot in the door the entire time, drew up an idea for a gameplay mechanic where we would acquire a doll, who we now know to be Poppy Playtime, and use the drawstring on her back to shoot her across the factory and grab stuff from far away, which would eventually be reworked and turned into the grab pack hand system that we see in the game today. At this point, Mob saw that Isaac had a vision and handed the keys over to him, naming him the director of the game. And from there, he started working on chapter 1, which was originally meant to be this expansive first look at the franchise, with tons of areas to explore like office buildings, had an intro that took place outside of the factory, and dozens of puzzles to solve, leading up to an iconic meet with the chapter's first villain, Huggy Wuggy. They would launch a teaser trailer showcasing the character Poppy in May of 2021 to try and build some hype for the title, but this trailer would, generally speaking, not generate very much attention to the title, and so, likely due to this, while developing, they had to scale back a lot of their original ambitions with the game quite a bit, scrapping a lot of the filler areas and shortening the game to around 20 to 30 minutes. Regardless though, they kept developing and would create and release a trailer in September of 2021, showcasing some of the gameplay with characters like Bron the dinosaur and of course Poppy in another attempt to catch some buzz, while also to hopefully get extra funding for future chapters, would launch a Kickstarter project on the same day called Poppy Playtime, a horror game that's actually got gameplay, requesting $45,000 and advertising the game as a new revolutionary horror title. See, following the release of games like Bendy and the Ink Machine, one of the main criticisms was that it, among other games, were walking simulators, or basically just a game that doesn't feature much gameplay gameplay and instead is focused on just walking around progressing the story, while Poppy advertised itself as a horror game where the toys play with you instead and walking isn't the only mechanic. Here they discuss the game itself and its various advertised mechanics, while also showing ambitions like wanting to create a VR version and making future chapters at a cost of just $5 a piece. They even offered some rewards to backers, like getting a copy of Chapter 1 for donating $5, the soundtrack for $10, your name in the credits for $25, a Poppy Playtime background pack for $50, your own child drawing in the game for $100, art of your own toy in the game for $250, and finally, have your own toy in the actual physical canon game for $500, all expected to be delivered by December of 2021 if the funding goal was reached. However, once again, their efforts to get this game out there failed miserably. The trailer barely got any attention, and the Kickstarter in its 1 month of existence only had $222 pledged before being canceled. Everything at this point had gone wrong for the developers. So with what budget they could afford to lose, they completed the rest of the game on their own and finished it months early, with the chapter slated to release on October 12th. Right before release, Mob had basically no hope of it going anywhere. Everything they've tried to do to get the game out there had failed, and it seems like it was going to be another game that nobody would ever pay attention to. However, they had one final plan to try and get some eyes on it. They found a bunch of YouTubers' socials and would email them with keys asking to play the game on their channel in a Hail Mary attempt. Then, at last, the game launched. As mentioned, the gameplay in this shortened chapter was extremely simple. We play as a former employee of Playtime Co., which had since been abandoned. However, after receiving a letter from a mysterious sender claiming the employees were still there and that we needed to find a flower, we enter the factory to investigate what happened. Where from there, after acquiring the grab pack, we come across this chapter's main attraction, Huggy Wuggy, who stalks us throughout the chapter up until the end, where he savagely ambushes the player and they are forced into a vent chase that, after escaping, brings us to the flower room containing Poppy and ending the chapter. While the game itself had basically no hype going into this point, shockingly, the emails that Mob sent out to YouTubers would get responses from big creators like Dawko, who said they'd play the game and would later on feature it on their channels, putting hundreds of thousands of eyes on the title. And as more and more creators began to do this and showcase it, one thing was immediately clear. People actually loved the game. The grab pack mechanic was incredibly interesting. The story was what you'd expect from this genre of game, both intriguing while also secretive. But of course, the main draw was the main villain, Huggy Wuggy. I know Huggy has been an internet icon for so long that he's lost a lot of his horror sting, and to the outside community has been a character associated with content farms and Skibbity Toilet and stuff like that, but I can't overstate how great of a character he was in this chapter. His first reveal is done perfectly, having him tower over the player seemingly lifelessly with the remaining moonlight from the roof shining over him, and his chase scene is still one of the best of all time. The randomly opening and shutting vents as Huggy corners us is one of the most anxiety-inducing things I've ever played. It legitimately felt like I had just ridden a roller coaster after the chase, and if you've played it, you know exactly what I mean. And plus, outside of the game, he's just a very scary looking character. I mean, the only reason I ever even checked the game out and domino affected years later to making this video was because after seeing Markiplier's thumbnail that showcased Huggy Wuggy, I was so enamored by this creepy Sour Patch Kid character that I had to go and check it out for myself. And clearly, everybody else did as well, because this game began to grow a community of dedicated fans interested in the story, lore, and just the lovable characters. It even eventually got the coveted game theory episode most developers can only ever dream of. The game was so successful that just a couple weeks after it dropped, they launched a little teaser trailer announcing a second chapter and teasing a brand new villain. However, with such a high profile comes comes a lot of natural criticism. At its core, the game was simple, scary, and a fun time, which most people generally agreed on. However, at the same time, many people were critical of the game for one main reason. As mentioned, the lack of budget and lack of hope in the project more than likely led to it being as short as it is, which isn't inherently a bad thing. However, they also still needed to make money from the game to recoup their losses, so it cost $5 for less than 30 minutes of gameplay. It's honestly kind of unfortunate under the previously mentioned context that the game was supposed to be bigger, but it wasn't because of money constraints. So realistically, they kind of cornered themselves. However, I think people would be more understanding of this if it wasn't for their many other attempts to monetize the game that were a lot more frowned upon. Like, for one, their merchandise. After the game blew up, the developers were extremely quick to launch tons of merch for the game, despite it being so short to the point where they were literally launching shirts that were just pictures of VHS tapes because there was so little content to make merch about. Plus, as I'm sure you guys already know about, in December of 2021, once they began to work on Chapter 2, to tease and market the chapter, they released digital collectibles, or NFTs, that contained secrets for the next game. Obviously, these were a disaster and put a whole new negative light on the series, whereas the smaller stuff like the price tag or the merchandise might have been acceptable on their own. All of this combined started to build the impression that the developers were greedy. Furthermore, an allegation that was made back when the game first launched, but especially started to build traction around this time, was another animation channel, Coaster, accused Mob of stealing from the game he was working on, Venge, with some side-by-side comparisons that definitely weren't all that similar, but it did also reference a previous drama between some of Mob's eventual employees in 2018 and 2019, where they were being rude and especially petty towards the animator after he blew up on the scene. And while this drama wasn't related to the Poppy Playtime game specifically and took place years before it, it was still a huge deal at the time when it resurfaced and affected how people viewed at least the game's creators ever since. Speaking of comparisons though, people were also quick to compare this game's story to Bendy and the Ink Machine, as both took place in abandoned factories where iconic characters were brought to life only to have them attack us, which brought up the discussion of if Poppy was copying their story as well. Another drama was that they would also capitalize on this success further by immediately announcing they were going to make a movie on the game, which felt over ambitious at best for a game with only one chapter and cash grabby at worst. So Poppy had established itself as a great and quality game with some morally questionable decisions from the developers both in their past and present. But despite this, the game kept exploding immensely, especially across YouTube. Maybe even too much, as naturally the game started to have tons of videos on the platform, be it theories, gameplays, or most importantly, animations and songs, whose popularity started to catch the attention of various articles and eventually news broadcasts that would begin to warn parents about the game's main character, Huggy Wuggy, specifically citing fan-made content like this music video from Try Hard Ninja, mistaking it for official, and accusing it of directly leading to children attempting dangerous activities in school. I made an entire video going over the history of these reports already. It's a huge rabbit hole, but to summarize, nobody really took these news reports too seriously. Although on the bright side, it did draw attention to certain fan-made content, going as far as having a local sheriff's office call out specific channels, usually in the animation genre, for making potentially dangerous videos targeted at young children, including the game's characters. So it's safe to say that this game's explosion was an absolute nightmare. They would eventually release now deleted statements apologizing to Coaster on at least some fronts, claimed they donated all of their NFT proceeds, and would make separate statements against the news for their claims of Mob targeting children to save face. But as bad as this era was, it wasn't without its positives, as Chapter 1 was made free a little while later, and eventually they officially started the rollout of their second Endeavor Chapter 2. First though, I wanted to let you guys know that I'm partnered with the drink company G Fuel, where you guys can get 20% off anything in their site using the code SHEEP. This includes their classic collector boxes and flavors in powder form, or there's their can forms, which are super convenient and honestly are just as good. Remember, use code SHEEP for a big discount. The link is in the description. Thank you guys for supporting me, but back to the video. Going back to Mob's initial merch drop video released on their channel, a link could be found hiding inside, taking us to this website where we could browse through various different parts of the chapter 1 we just explored through security cameras that initially seemed pretty uneventful. However, over time, a Catbee character could be spotted laying on Huggy's room in blood before mysteriously disappearing. Then, over in the Make a Friend room, some long, stretchy arms were seen wrapping around the area, teasing some kind of new character coming in Chapter 2 that, thanks to the hidden message revealed back in the NFTs mentioned earlier, was revealed to be named Mommy Longlegs. Leading up to February of 2022, where the Chapter 2 gameplay trailer would be released, becoming Mob's biggest trailer until and ever since, getting tens of millions of views, showcasing the devs' first full-length chapter with new characters, gameplay mechanics, including new grab pack hands, all sorts of new puzzles, and of course, its brand new villain, Mommy Longlegs, a pink, creepy, spider-like character that would be watching over us this time around. Now, this trailer was perceived super well and got people super excited for the chapter. However, there were some hiccups leading up to its release, like the release date of the title accidentally leaking for April before being delayed all the way until May 5th. But as the release date drew closer, the biggest question on people's minds was about how good this game would end up being this time around. Mob had gone from a studio with no expectations in Chapter 1 to having mountains of weight on their back in Chapter 2, being one of the biggest indie games out there. How would they handle building and releasing a full multi-hour experience? Was Poppy Playtime just a flavor of the month game that would die off once it tried something new? Well, eventually May 6th came and Chapter 2 released to an interesting result. Poppy Playtime Chapter 2 was meant to be the game that redeemed the franchise from all of the criticism, and while in a lot of ways this was definitely the case, it was also left with a significant amount of flaws and growing pains. This game takes place right where Chapter 1 left off and features a lot of similar themes, with lots of electric puzzles, an iconic chase scene with Mommy Longlegs towards the end, and of course many different characters and games to fill out the bigger runtime. Ending with us acquiring the train code to access the train, and teaming up with Poppy, who was supposed to let us escape, but betrayed us and changed the tracks to dig us deeper into the factory before the train crashes and the chapter ends, flashing one final time to a sign that says Play Care. Now, first off, there were a lot of good redeeming things about this chapter that proved Mob was to be taken seriously. For one, there's its length. This chapter, in fact, takes multiple hours to beat, and while Chapter 1 felt more like a demo, this felt like the level of length and depth that Mob originally wanted to create when making these chapters. Another plus is that the game itself actually took full advantage of the grab pack, taking seemingly simple games like Whack-A-Mole or Red Light Green Light and forcing us to panically smack away devilish Huggies or grapple around a playground while a hungry caterpillar, PJ Pugapillar, chases us down. The puzzles themselves outside of the mini games were also much more expansive and interesting, while the lore was much more fleshed out, shining a spotlight over the game's overarching villain, the Prototype, and revealing there was once children that roamed Playtime Co. that have also gone missing. Furthermore, the final death scene in this game is absolutely stellar, where after running from Mommy Longlegs for the entire game, we finally get to kill her, but not just by dropping dropping her into an abyss or something like that with Huggy, but rather by grinding her up into pieces while she screams and begs for mercy, only for her head to drop off and the mysterious prototype to take her remains. This scene represented a tonal shift from the rest of the game and was something fans absolutely loved. However, this being said, there was also a lot of criticism about this game. For one, speaking on the horror, while this one scene was super well done, the rest of the game was noticeably absent of the same horror felt in Chapter 1. It has jump scares, of course, but throughout most of the game, things were usually bright. There was a lot of dialogue that took the immersion away, compared to Chapter 1, where its only villain, Huggy Wuggy, never spoke and just maniacally chased us. And overall, it felt like Poppy had taken a step back in the horror department and felt a bit more like a puzzle game with horror elements rather than a horror game with puzzle elements. This very much led to the popular stigma I'll discuss more that plagues a lot of mascot horror, that Poppy was this diet horror game for kids that was more focused on its colorful characters rather than providing something scary. The previously mentioned dialogue also made the game feel bloated and often boring, like they just shoved it in to fill time. And there were also a ton of glitches in this game as well. Like originally on some devices, the game would soft lock when pulling the berry cart, getting stuck in place no matter what, making the game completely unbeatable. You could also just skip the Mommy Longlegs final chase scene entirely by jumping up into this area up here and dying, which I did on my first playthrough and was left so confused. The bugs in this one were pretty intense. Plus, while their Kickstarter from last year had mentioned making every chapter a $5 add-on, this game was $10, bringing up the greed allegations to another level. But regardless, a lot of these criticisms were much smaller than the previous ones with Chapter 1, and Chapter 2 generally was a smashing success. In terms of numbers, the game had over 13,000 players playing it at once on Steam, which actually outdid the launch of Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, at least on Steam. People mostly loved Mommy Longlegs. The lore and gameplay, outside of the flaws mentioned earlier, lived up to the hype, and Poppy was in a pretty good state, at least compared to where it was beforehand. But while they were in a good spot for now, they wanted to go much, much further later in the year. Following the release of Chapter 2, fans dug through the title's code to find that there were files listed under Poppy Playtime Multiplayer. And when loading them, players were brought to some kind of brick wall with Mommy Longlegs and Huggy Wuggy poseless sitting in front of it. People didn't know what this was, but quickly their sights would be shifted, as in August of 2022, the developers would release a brand new trailer for Poppy Playtime Chapter 3. This trailer showcased various toys laying on the floor, rising up to show this weird gas mask, while the Playtime co-founder, Elliot Ludwig, described a place called Playcare, which would end up becoming Chapter 3's location, as an in-house orphanage that stored children inside of the factory, also being mentioned in a Chapter 1 poster, and of course seen on the sign at the end of Chapter 2, ending with a confirmed release date of 2023. And while it looked exciting for sure, the trailer was notably bare bones, and multiple months after Chapter 2, it seemed like the devs were very much taking their time with this next chapter, if this is all they had to show for it so far. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be any content, as on October 12th of 2022, the Poppy developers would celebrate their 1-year anniversary of this successful title by posting a video with the game's director Isaac thanking everybody for their support along with the rest of the team. But quickly, people spotted that something weird was going on in this video, as looking at the anniversary art they drew on the whiteboard behind Isaac, next to Huggy, we could see this weird Jack-in-the-Box, something we had never seen up until this point. And at the end of the trailer, we see a glitch that shows the numbers 10/31/22, spelling out the date October 31st, along with some Latin text that that when translated said "not what you expect" and the same Jack-in-the-Box silhouette. So from here, it was a waiting game, and on October 31st, we finally got something. The devs posted an announcement for a brand new co-op game they were working on called Project Playtime, giving us a new teaser image along with an IP address hidden in the center. This was also met with content creators receiving a letter in the mail from somebody named Rowan Stoll, panicking and asking the recipient to access their computer using the same IP. So to make a long story short, because it took all night to figure out what to do next, when connecting to the IP through an FTP server and a password found in another document in the replies of the announcement, we were able to access a computer remotely that contained a video from the guy that sent said letter, Rowan Stoll, recording a report about apparently spotting cameras in the eyes of Huggy Wuggy and expressing concern. This started what is called an ARG, or alternate reality game, where over time more and more clues were revealed through these puzzles about the upcoming game, leading up to the end where after Rowan Stoll discovered all of these monsters were once children experimented on to use for work, he ended up getting trapped and eaten by the Jack-in-the-Box character, who we then learned was Boxy Boo, a character that's grown into a fan favorite in the community, but actually was pretty controversial at the time outside of it, with a lot of people criticizing his general design not being very well done. Then, after finally solving this ARG, we were rewarded with 2 trailers for Project Playtime. One cinematic trailer finally showcasing Boxy in his full glory, and another finally showcasing the gameplay of Project, which essentially was Poppy's attempt at an ASIM like Dead by Daylight. 6 different survivors would try to collect 6 toy parts by completing puzzles throughout various maps and then would escape, while one player playing as a monster, Huggy, Mommy, or Boxy, tried to hunt them down. This game was slated to release on December 6th, but immediately faced a huge hiccup, as due to a major problem found on the day of release, the devs had to delay the game by multiple days, all the way until December 12th, where finally the title dropped, and once again, Mob was found in a new wave of controversy. While the game itself was a good idea and a good time when it worked, the short development time from Chapter 2 to now really showed, as it was extremely buggy and basic. Many of the icons were still development placeholders, the glitches were consistently game-breaking, the servers almost never functioned properly, making the game basically unplayable, and overall, Project Playtime was even more bittersweet than Chapter 2. As mentioned, it was certainly a fun time, the game performed super well, opening to over 16,000 players, and there was even a lot of lore thrown into the game, like the introduction of Harley Sawyer, or the Doctor, the creator of the monsters we see in the games, but it just didn't feel finished, and the greed allegations from before were not helped by them adding a battle pass to this game for cosmetics and an item shop, which also had its fair share of glitches, with the shop itself not working properly, making that aspect of the game also feel rushed and glitchy like the rest of the game, to the point where overall this project was extremely controversial. Some fans swore by the game with their life, and others absolutely hated it. Thankfully though, going into 2023, the developers started releasing various lore VHS tapes on their channel for the next chapter, while also releasing patches, events, and content updates to Project Playtime to fix a lot of the aforementioned issues, at least until October of 2023, where they would controversially abandon the game and not update it ever since, leading to it pretty much losing all of its audience, as they needed to spare more resources to work on their next chapter, Chapter 3. So, with Project Playtime being completed and eventually ended, this meant it was finally time for Chapter 3. And honestly, going into this, people weren't too optimistic about Poppy Playtime. The various controversies, large amount of brain rot children's content that began to flood the YouTube space, inconsistent releases, and how buggy their last game was kind of gave Poppy an unserious tone in the discussion of mascot horror games. It was seen as the more childish of the big major horror titles. However, going into Chapter 3, it seemed a big focus from the developers was to change this narrative. In July of 2023, the developers would drop a brand new second teaser trailer, along with a new ARG website that at this point would remain mostly vacant. As for the trailer though, immediately the devs showed they had something to prove here. This one didn't start with some generic creepy music or dialogue or anything. Rather, it started in complete silence, only broken up by crashing flames. We see the train crash site from the end of Chapter 2 and find the door to the Playcare orphanage. But as we go into the area, it's not some colorful, happy place, but a dark, silent graveyard. It flashes to the photos of children's faces, showing the despair in their eyes when they once resided here. We see a mauled up Huggy Wuggy dripping in blood, a massive, mysterious creation towering over us to the sounds of children crying, and on the walls, messages to some kind of godlike creature are scratched in by a mysterious purple beast that drags us towards a deep, dark hallway, only broken up by their glowing eyes and ominous red gas coming from their mouth, before the beast jump scares us and the trailer ends. This trailer was a complete mood changer in the franchise. Chapters 1 and 2 were good warm-ups for sure, but this seems like the moment where things got real for Poppy Playtime. This trailer immediately got fans and even critics extremely interested in what new direction Poppy was taking here, especially since they announced at the end of the trailer the game would be releasing in winter of 2023, launching the hype to new levels. And going into the end of 2023, things only got better, as eventually the developers would launch the Chapter 3 ARG, where once again the community dug through different documents and puzzles in search of clues on a computer website, where we learned that this creature in the trailer wasn't just one lone being, but rather a collection of 8 different characters called the Smiling Critters, with the purple one being a cat named Catnap. Here we would be met with an entire cartoon and all sorts of lore about these critters, but Catnap stood out as being odd. We'd learn in the cartoon that he wasn't like the rest, never talking, and like in the previous teaser trailer, spat out this red gas that ends up putting the other critters to sleep. And later on, we'd see Catnap get removed from the in-universe marketing, as children reported horrific nightmares after purchasing the plush version of the character that, unlike others, emitted this toxic sleeping gas. Regardless though, we learn in the ARG that this gas was intentionally created by Playtime Co. and was used to make a bigger body out of the character from a child named Theo to spit around Playcare and put all of the children inhabitants to sleep. Following this marketing push, the anticipation for this game was at an all-time high, as the Smiling Critters and their cartoon became debatedly Mob's most popular creation yet. Yes, even more popular than Huggy Wuggy. These critters, without Chapter 3 even being released yet, became like the most popular thing on the entire internet, as they were creepy in their cartoon, but also were super cute and marketable. Everybody in the community seemed to have a favorite Smiling Critter. But in terms of Chapter 3, as 2023 approached its final weeks, fans were starting to scratch their heads. There was still no gameplay trailer or final announcement going into December of that year, with some even worrying, like with their many other projects, it had gotten delayed. And sadly, this would end up being true, as they would announce on December 12th that Chapter 3 was going to be pushed into 2024. However, on the bright side, this was met with our very first gameplay trailer finally, where inside we got to see the game looks almost completely different than Chapter 2. The graphics are way better, the scenery is way darker, there are tons of new gameplay pieces and better animation, there are more locations than ever, and overall this trailer was phenomenally well received. arrived. Fast forward into 2024, we got ourselves one final trailer, showing off even more gameplay, and the full reveal of Catnap's bigger body, with the announcement that the game would be releasing on January 30th. And as that day finally approached, while expectations were certainly high, what fans would end up getting was possibly one of the best mascot horror entries of all time. Chapter 3 started off right after the train crash in Chapter 2, and after exploring the train station, we ran into a new ally named Ollie that directed us into Playcare, a large dome-like area that was noticeably more expansive than the little side room from the last teaser trailer, and was instead traded off for this huge mini-city with homes, schools, stores, and more, with our job being to go into all of these locations and power up all of their generators to repower the production zone where the red gas was being created and move it down deeper into Playtime Go, ending with Poppy and our other new ally, Kissy Missy, rewarding us for our task by showing us what happened to the employees, revealing a VHS tape called The Hour of Joy, where in an organized attack, all of the imprisoned monsters ambush the employees, killing every single one of them. Then, of course, to keep the game interesting while going on the lift to the next chapter, Kissy Missy gets attacked, which is where it ends. This Poppy Playtime chapter is probably as close to perfect as it gets, and it changed the entire way people looked at the franchise ever since. Beforehand, Poppy was looked at as controversial and in a lot of ways less matured than other franchises before it. However, while it didn't exterminate those claims, this one took the route of being significantly darker, both in its presentation, as we saw in the trailers, and the gameplay itself, which is noticeably literally darker, but it also features a lot more graphic scenes, like Catnap literally getting impaled after beating him in his boss fight, or Miss Delight getting slammed by the door after escaping her school. But also, there's much deeper things like the lore itself, which goes into graphic and disturbing detail about the children that once stayed in Playcare being essentially tortured and used as science experiments for the profit of Playtime Go. Or after reaching the end of the playhouse, we walk in on the last remaining smiling critter bigger body, Dog Day, who had his body hung up in the prison where the smaller critters feasted on him bit by bit like some kind of saw trap. This moment has even had full-blown videos talking about this one scene, calling it the moment Poppy Playtime was redeemed. But in my opinion, the best done scene in this chapter that rivals the best moments in any indie horror game I've ever seen takes place in Home Sweet Home, the place where the children slept, where we were forced to walk through the red smoke, and as we explore, we begin to hallucinate long dark hallways. Throughout, we see messages alluding to us being guilty about something, while radio reports document one of Playtime Co.'s victims being discovered to the outside world. As we pass through where the children once slept, we eventually come across our old office, and going towards the sounds of children screaming, we come across one of the laboratories where they were experimented on and turned into these monsters. Then, in a VHS tape inside, the commentator begins to shame the player for returning, as a demonic Huggy comes out of the TV and eats us, causing this nightmare hallucination to end, and we wake up. This scene is done absolutely perfectly, as it shows the player's reason for returning was actually a sense of guilt for what happened to the children and eventually the employees who went missing, feeling trapped in our own grief only for one of the monsters we helped create to come out and attack us like we deserved. It's a wonderful way of showing the player's emotions without them ever even speaking a single word, and I'd argue it's the best part of all of the entire game. Overall, this chapter was absolutely loved by nearly everybody. Fans and critics both praised it. It had a comparable number of players to Chapter 2 with 13,000, and while the game definitely isn't perfect, as there are still a little bit of glitches, the smiling critters don't appear in the game as much as many people would have wanted to, especially Catnap, who doesn't have that many main focus scenes. The game cost $15, so another price increase, and the game on the first couple playthroughs can honestly be a bit confusing. Other than that, most people consider this to be Poppy Playtime's magnum opus, the moment where the game peaked. Following the absolute massive victory that Chapter 3 was, everyone was extremely happy and satisfied with the game. However, if there was one thing that fans were still left a bit upset about, it was the turnover time and the delays to create these games. Chapter 3 got delayed multiple times internally, originally supposed to be released multiple months beforehand, and with them working on Project Playtime as well, it took over a year and a half to see Chapter 3 following Chapter 2, and the thought of waiting another year and a half, if not more, for Chapter 4 worried fans. However, quickly, the mob devs made it clear in some public statements that we wouldn't have to wait nearly as long for the next chapter. So it seemed like basically everything was going perfect for the Poppy franchise. However, right after this, multiple big problems emerged. For one, mob would post at the start of the year that they would be releasing a Poppy multiplayer game with Jazzwares on Roblox. That was honestly pretty terrible, and when there was already a Poppy multiplayer game in Project Playtime that they abandoned, releasing a much lower budget Roblox game felt like a slap in the face of fans of that title. But two, relating to the chapters themselves, something I intentionally left out was that back in December of 2023, multiple developers announced that Chapter 3 was going to be their last chapter working on Poppy Playtime, and from then on would be leaving due to managerial and creative differences, with the most notable one being Isaac, the director of the last 3 chapters, who announced his departure in March of 2024, leaving Chapter 4 in the hands of many new people. Around this same time, people also discovered Mob Entertainment's Glassdoor reviews, which is a website where people review companies that they work for, where alleged former employees described the mob workplace as toxic and at worst abusive, which gave a new light into why a lot of these employees might have been leaving and why there were consistent issues with projects getting delayed and stuff like that. It's really difficult to gauge how many of these reviews are from actual workers or how true the things they were saying were, but this definitely put Mob in an interesting spot where people were leaving and others were anonymously saying some super serious things. So even though their previous work was their best yet, many fans were wondering how Mob would move forward and how this all might affect the future of the games. And well, like expected, Chapter 4 would roll out much earlier than Chapter 3. In September of 2024, the first teaser trailer for the chapter would drop, where this time they would reveal a new set of characters, the Nightmare Critters, showcasing Baba Chops in the trailer and later on revealing 7 other ones, which were essentially the Smiling Critters but with negative traits instead of good ones. This trailer and reveal immediately began to raise alarms for fans of the franchise, as first off, the Nightmare Critters themselves were not popular and were accused of just trying to piggyback off the success that was the Smiling Critters, and were nothing more than content farm or Benji X Scarlet bait. While the trailer itself was very obviously made in a pinch. It had music playing over the entire thing with no audio. There was a bunch of animation errors with clipping and things even just randomly flinging around, which obviously immediately concerned people. However, while this was all worrying, things from here actually went smoother than ever, as once again the devs would drop another computer-based ARG that this time was super creative, with puzzles not just online but also in real life where people could find real items teasing upcoming characters. And when the next teaser trailer dropped, they revealed a new monster, Yarnaby, that was super well received and loved by fans, simultaneously showcasing this new area known as the prison, where the failed experiments were stored and tested, including this sideways face monster. Furthermore, they would reveal another new character in Pianosaurus through a YouTube short, and perhaps most interestingly of all, revealed that one of the game's main villains in the lore, Harley Sawyer, was actually still alive and would show up in Chapter 4 as this TV-headed being that was hardwired to the entire factory and was watching over us the entire time. These teasers had fans going insane for Chapter 4. If anything, the build-up to this game was more exciting than Chapter 3. The story seemed darker than ever, the trailers were essentially mini-movies, and furthermore, in the last Doctor trailer, we got our final release date of January 30th, 30th, 2025, just 1 year after Chapter 3. The only real hiccup at this point was that Mob would re-release Chapters 2 and 3 onto console around this time, with the catnap banner art being traced from a fan render, which is unfortunately extremely common in this industry, as when artists are looking for references, sometimes they get mistaken between what's real and what's fake, but thankfully this was fixed within a few hours, and that's really where it stood. But the next major issue that arose in this Chapter 4 rollout is the developers were noticeably extremely shy from showing any gameplay. There weren't any gameplay screenshots, gameplay trailers, not even any gameplay info from the developers, so it led to the question, where is it? Well, about 1 week before launch, we would finally get the gameplay trailer, which would reveal the chapter's main character, Doughy the Dough Man, along with, of course, our first look into the gameplay itself. Now, the trailer itself was good and up to par with the previous ones, but why were they holding back showing off the gameplay and the chapter's key character for so long? Well, the good news is that on January 31st, Chapter 4 would end up releasing on time. However, when this chapter released, fans were generally mixed on this game, especially after the success of Chapter 3. Fans absolutely loved the story of the game as it dove more into the backstory of not just the creation of Playtime Co. and the monster's creator Harley Sawyer, but also what happened to the remaining toys after the Hour of Joy, being left mostly in anarchy while others formed a group in the safe haven to hide from the prototype who was after them. The various characters in the game, like Doughy the Dough Man and Yarnaby, were lovable and had super interesting stories in their own right, while there were a ton of big twists and turns this time around, like learning that our friend Ollie wasn't actually ever our friend and was instead the prototype mimicking a child's voice to trick us, while also learning the true reason Poppy made us come down here was to blow the entire place up, which is what we tried to do in Chapter 4 unsuccessfully. The ending was also extremely tear-jerking too, as we are forced to kill Doughy, who in a fit of rage attacked us, followed by us getting left alone when Poppy ran away from us out of fear of the prototype, and Kissy Missy was lost in an explosion by the prototype who stole all of our explosives. We also finally saw the return of Huggy Wuggy, who had survived his fall in Chapter 1 apparently, with a predictable but by all means welcome return for revenge. The game was also filled with great scenes graphically, like the toy graveyard. However, while there's a lot of pros, in terms of flaws, there's also quite a few. As for one, it was clear the reason this game didn't show off that much gameplay is because the story was clearly put at the forefront of this chapter, which as mentioned was done well, but it led to the gameplay being pretty underwhelming and underbaked, filled with areas that were boring, areas that were extremely frustrating, like the Yarnaby boss scene, and of course there was a fair share of glitches. There was also a lot of other things that people were just generally disappointed about after the big marketing push, like that Pianosaurus, who had his own teaser trailer, was used for one cutscene and that was all. And of course, once again, the price of the game went up to $20, which for a game that many people thought was a step down from Chapter 3 felt a bit ridiculous. Overall, Chapter 4 was not necessarily perceived as a bad game, especially as a lore lover. I got everything I could have ever wanted out of it. However, based on the super high expectations set with Chapter 3 that people were hoping they would surpass, and with the game having such an interesting set of gameplay mechanics that were kind of neglected this time around, Chapter 4 was simply put disappointing. The game got absolutely nuked on Steam, a bunch of creators made videos discussing this backlash, and overall Chapter 4 was a game that was built to tell a wonderful story first, but failed to supplement it with gameplay that pleased the overwhelming crowd. And now this leaves us in probably one of the most interesting times in the Poppy franchise. Millions still love the game itself, and it's debatedly more popular than it ever has been. Numbers wise, Poppy Playtime Chapter 4 drew 25,000 players on launch day, which is just shy of what Chapters 2 and 3 brought in combined on Steam alone. There has been much less company controversy as of late, as Mob has grown as a studio, but also at the same time, Chapter 4 showed that there are also some warning signs in that the new direction the game took without a lot of its chapters 1 to 3 staff might have had an effect on it in a negative way. And now, very similar to other chapters, I think we're all left wondering what is next for Poppy Playtime and how will they respond to this backlash for the upcoming chapter 5. Well, I'm not sure, but to end on an optimistic note, we saw the game come back from some of the most controversy I've ever seen, both valid and non-valid, to reach this point. So I think if they can do it once, they can do it again, even bigger and better, especially now that the game is unfortunately reaching a point where it's probably almost over. So now that the studio is bigger than ever and also more popular than ever, I have confidence they'll be able to come back from this and finish the rest of the game with a bang. But I guess only time will tell. Thank you guys so much for watching.